This evening's campaign launch celebration is centered around another key event in the life of AMBS, a public lecture in honor of a faculty member's advancement to full professor. Tonight, we celebrate that Dr. Jamie Pitts, following rigorous review of his alignment with the scholarship, teaching, service, and other expectations of the rank of full professor at AMBS, was advanced to full professor upon action of the Board of Directors in April 2023. Congratulations, Professor Pitts. Because we want the focus of this evening to be on his words, my introduction will not include the many details I could share about Jamie's background and contributions to the Academy and Church. Tonight we will keep it simple and simply rejoice that his academic journey from studying art history and Spanish at the University of Texas at Austin to earning the MDiv at Fuller Theological Seminary, where he discovered Anabaptist Mennonite faith, to his PhD in theology and ethics at University of Edinburgh, led him to AMBS. Here he is known for his commitment to his teaching craft, for active and wide-ranging scholarship, including the recent What Happened at Benham documentary and book project. He is also known for his sincere faith, for his love of the church, and for his commitment to learning with and from the global church. Jamie is a member of Hively Avenue Mennonite Church here in Elkhart. He is married to Brittany Purley, and we're delighted that she can be here this evening, along with his parents, Jamie's in-laws. And we give a special welcome to Jamie's friends and family watching in person or via live stream, including his parents. For 11 years, Jamie has, among his various teaching responsibilities, introduced AMBS students from all over the world to the emergence and early development of Anabaptist movements in 16th century Europe. He does this in a way that captures and carries forward deep interest in why the early Anabaptist commitment to living in the likeness of Christ was so radical and why it matters today. As we will hear tonight, Jamie is a scholar and teacher who uses stories, old and new, to create connections and to ponder new possibilities. For his full professor lectureship, Mysteries of Reconciliation, Culture, Violence, Politics, please join me in welcoming Dr. Jamie Pitts to the podium.
Thank you, Bev. It's an incredible honor to be here. I am deeply grateful to President David Bushart, Dean Beverly Lapp, members of the AMBS board, as well as my dear teaching faculty colleagues and other colleagues on the administrative faculty and staff, and especially to students. And students will feature heavily in what I'm going to talk about tonight. So I'll come back to that point. But I also want to thank the friends, family members, and other community members. I know there's some people from my church, Hively. It means a whole lot. What I'm going to be talking about tonight is really, it's a work in progress. It's an experiment, and it comes out of a course that I'm teaching called Reading Cultural Contexts. And over the past 6 weeks, we've been working through some stories and thinking about different theories of culture and relationships to those stories. And these are all Mennonite stories in various ways. And so what I'm going to do tonight is kind of talk through some of these stories. I'm not going to hit you with all the heavy theory that I'm making my students study, but I want us to reflect on these stories really as pictures of reconciliation, pictures of attempts at reconciliation in which intercultural understanding is at the heart of the attempt to reconcile. So whatever limitations you may judge there to be in my presentation, I will take full responsibility for. But I have to say that the best ideas come from my students. So I do want to thank Andrea Kramer, Susie Gifford, Christy Necht, Amy Marshall, Mari Martinez Cruz, Yoel Tracun, Masia Wong, Daniel Nuerti, and Peter Wigginton, the students of Reading Cultural Context, because they are central to the conversations that have shaped my thinking about what I'm going to talk about. In the later Pauline writings of the New Testament, the term mystery frequently refers to the unity in Christ of Jews and Gentiles. Here are two quotations from the letter to the Ephesians along these lines, and if you would put that up next. God has taken pleasure in revealing the mystery of the plan through Christ to be carried out in the fullness of time, namely, to bring all things in heaven and on earth together in Christ. In his own flesh, Christ abolished the law with its commandments and ordinances in order to make the two, Gentiles and Jews, into one person, thus establishing peace and reconciling us all to God in one body through the cross, which put to death the enmity between us. In these and related passages, the good news of Jesus Christ is the message that peace has replaced enmity, hatred, between opposing groups of people. Peace has been achieved through Christ's reconciling work on the cross. Peace is present in congregations composed of reconciled Jews and Gentiles. And peace will reign in the fullness of time, an ultimate reconciliation. According to the author of Ephesians, the mystery of reconciliation, and if you'll go to the next slide here, Christian, the mystery of reconciliation, the mystery of Christ, was unknown to the people of former ages, but is now revealed by the Spirit to the holy apostles and prophets. Here, mystery names something previously hidden and now revealed. The mystery of reconciliation is not, from this perspective, mysterious in the sense of something that's difficult to understand or fundamentally unknowable. It is a profound truth, but it is not now an obscure one. Admittedly, there's plenty to be confused about when trying to understand how the reconciliation won by Christ and promised at the eschaton is to shape the church today. The book of Acts and Paul's letters bear witness to the difficulties of reconciling Jews and Gentiles into a single community. That difficulty would be compounded as Jews and Christians eventually divided into separate communities, and as Christians came to persecute Jews over many long centuries. In many contexts today, the Christian message of reconciliation is associated with imperialism, with the violent imposition of a false peace on terms set largely by and for the benefit of the powerful. Reconciliation is therefore for us a mystery, both in the sense described by Ephesians and in the more everyday sense for us of something we struggle to comprehend. That's an issue for us Mennonites because we strongly emphasize the present reality of reconciliation in the church. It's a real problem for us here at AMBS because, and if you'll hit the next slide, we've got this word in our own mission statement. So if we are educating followers of Jesus Christ to be leaders for God's reconciling mission in the world, what is this mystery of reconciliation? So I want to work at this challenge tonight by focusing on a single dimension of reconciliation, and specifically of reconciliation in the present. That, as I mentioned, is a dimension about intercultural understanding, which I would argue is central to any attempt at reconciling opposing groups. Reconciliation without understanding is liable to reinforce the assumptions of the more powerful group that is being reconciled. But understanding can also be a kind of weapon. It can be an attempt to control the members of another culture or to eliminate and unilaterally modify that culture. As we'll see, the extent to which understanding is genuinely intercultural is the extent to which it promotes genuine reconciliation and not domination. To get at some of the features of a form of intercultural understanding that promotes reconciliation, I want to tell 3 stories. As I mentioned, these are Mennonite stories, and each of them involves a European or an American, sometimes both, Mennonites on a mission. In each case, the mission engages colonized peoples and includes an account of those people's cultures. And I want to think about how these examples of Euro-American Mennonite mission represent more or less successful attempts at intercultural understanding aimed at reconciliation. After telling these stories, I'll think about what we can learn from them about a version of intercultural understanding that not only avoids, but also challenges the imperialism that casts doubt for many on the possibility and desirability of reconciliation. So the first story, as you see, is about Henry and Martha Mosier Vogt and the Hopi. Heinrich Vogt, or Henry Vogt, was a Mennonite who as a teenager migrated from the Alexanderville village in the Russian Empire to Kansas. He became active in the early General Conference Mennonite Church Foreign Mission, as they called it, which meant going from Kansas to Oklahoma. And so in the 1880s, he joined the first GC, General Conference mission, among the Cheyenne and Arapaho peoples in Oklahoma. And then in the 1890s, he initiated a new work in Arizona among the Hopi. In 1893, he and his new wife, Martha Mosier Vogt, who also born in Alexanderville, Russia, settled in the Hopi village of Aribe, which you see a bit of in this picture. They ministered on and off there for about the next 10 years until Martha died in childbirth in 1901, and Henry left the next year. The Vogts were often sick, and it was the support of the Hopi who enabled them to survive and get their mission started. The Vogts provided medicine, food, and other resources to the Hopi when they had them available. Henry established a Sunday school, and Martha taught sewing classes to Hopi women, which they thought was very funny because in that culture, men did the sewing. The scholar Kathy Ann Trotta has described how Martha, in particular, was able to participate in the matrilineal Hopi culture's networks of gift exchange and reciprocal hospitality. Both Henry and Martha quickly learned the Hopi language, and they documented various aspects of Hopi culture through photography. Henry became known really as the preeminent scholar of the Hopi and a collector of Hopi artifacts. Together they hosted numerous scholars, journalists, government officials interested in learning more about the Hopi. And Henry formed a close working relationship with the Field Museum in Chicago. He spent over a year setting up their Hopi exhibit, and then after his retirement from mission work, published around 10 books through the Field Museum, all of Hopi ritual description, essentially. In reports to the General Conference and other mission boards, Henry frequently described his attempts at understanding the Hopi as instrumental to his mission of converting them to Christianity. He claimed that the more he understood them by studying their language and rituals, the more he realized they dwelled in a darkness that could only be dispelled by the light of Christ. However, Henry articulated a different kind of mission in a letter to a fellow collector. He said, I am collecting a private collection for scientific purposes. Although his evangelistic mission could be judged a failure, no Hopi converted during his decade of ministry, his scientific mission was arguably more successful. Did Henry Vogt understand the Hopi, he certainly understood or knew a lot about them. He seems to have understood to some degree the integrity and richness of their culture as well. In some reports, he acknowledged that fellow European Americans might see the Hopi rituals as childish, but he emphasized that they were quite serious to their participants. There's some evidence also that he opposed U.S. government programs related to forced schooling, elimination of indigenous cultures, and the division of communal lands into private allotments. But the Hopi later learned, and they were furious to find out that Henry's photographs and these detailed descriptions, 10 books worth of descriptions of Hopi ritual, had not just been kept for his private collection, but in fact were displayed prominently at the Field Museum in Chicago. And that other scholars that he had hosted similarly shared ritual secrets that were not intended to be shared beyond the circle of trust that he had been invited into. There were also stories, and you can go to the next slide here. Actually, 2 more slides. I skipped that part, but you got it. There's a story included in a later autobiography of Don Talayesva, who was a child when the votes were in Araibi. And he recalled this wicked man who would force his way into rituals to write down everything he could see. He wore shoes with solid heels, and when the Hopi would try to put them out, he kicked them. A few years after that, in 1949, some Hopi leaders released a public statement addressed to President Harry S. Truman. The statement reasserted Hopi land claims and rejected U.S. military adventures, at that time NATO. The statement read in part, "This land," if you can bring it up here, "this land is a sacred home of the Hopi people. It was given to the Hopi people the task to guard this land, not by force of arms, not by killing, not by confiscating properties of others, but by humble prayers, by obedience to our traditional and religious instructions, and by being faithful to our great spirit, Masau. We are still a sovereign nation. We have never abandoned our sovereignty to any foreign power or nation. We've been self-governing people long before any white man came to our shores. What great spirit made and planned, no power on earth can change." Henry Vogt seems to have understood to some degree the Hopi's relation to their land, the importance of their traditions. But he might not have fully understood what's captured in this term sovereignty. In his evangelistic and scientific missions, he failed to understand that Hopi spirituality and culture were not objects to be extracted, but they were part of a tightly woven political sovereignty of the Hopi people, part of their self-determination as a people. He did not understand how these elements were central to the Hopi's ability to govern themselves in their land according to their own understanding of the will of the Great Spirit. In his quest for reconciling understanding, Henry Vogt violated the hidden mystery of Hopi sovereignty. We'll go to the next slide here. And the next story. This is a very different story. This is a woman who got the sovereignty piece. Elizabeth von Dyck was born in 1950 in Schleswig-Holstein in the very northern part of Germany near the Danish border. This was an area in which Mennonites from West Prussia in the agricultural region around Danzig, or Gdansk, had fled from the Russian army at the end of World War II. So she was essentially born to refugees, Mennonite refugees, in a kind of refugee settlement. And over the next few years, her parents moved first to Uruguay, where there was another settlement from that area, and then to a town in southwest Germany called Inkenbach, which was yet another refugee settlement from West Prussia from that same region. And she returned as a teenager to Enkenbach in 1964, and it seems like, I can't quite figure out her biography, but it seems like she went to university or moved to the university town of Heidelberg within the next few years. Around 1970 in Heidelberg, she joined a group called the Socialist Patients Collective. This was similar to many, there were anti-psychiatry groups around Europe at the time. Michel Foucault is probably the most famous exemplar of this tendency. This group saw mainstream capitalist society as the sick society, and the people who were judged to have mental disorders, they were the ones who could see things clearly. And so the socialist patients were going to destroy the capitalist system to unveil the truth of the culture. That group didn't last very long for various reasons, and Van Dyck and several other of her Socialist Patients Collective comrades joined a new group called the Red Army Faction. Some of you may have heard of this. It's also known as the Baader-Meinhof Gang. This was and I'm going to be referring to the Red Army Faction as the RAF, for your awareness. So the RAF, you can now go to the next slide. Thank you. Was formed as a Marxist-Leninist guerrilla organization. As Marxist-Leninists, they were convinced that the revolution would come through a vanguard that would stay true to Marxist teaching and essentially capture the state and establish a dictatorship in the name of the workers. As guerrilla, I'll say that they didn't see revolution as imminent in West Germany. And so they looked across to Latin America, to Uruguay, to Brazil, and other places in Latin America, and saw that where revolution was not forthcoming, these groups went underground and carried out public actions and released manifestos and so forth to inspire down the line the revolution that they saw as inevitable. And so as a Marxist-Leninist guerrilla, they were a secret organization of people totally devoted to the cause, so they went underground. They didn't have jobs in the capitalist system. They were totally off the grid, other than their actions, their public actions, and the manifestos. After some of those actions, which included bombings, the original members of the RAF fled to Jordan, where they met up with Palestinian liberation fighters and received arms trainings. This experience, as well as their overall ideological orientation, led them to embrace an anti-imperialism as the center of their work. And throughout its history, the RAF would connect with Third World revolutionaries in what were called rear bases throughout the Middle East and Africa. After a series of bombings in 1972 that included a couple US military installations in West Germany, the RAF's leadership was almost entirely arrested. But after the arrest, it became widely known that the prisoners were being kept in brutal, prolonged solitary confinement, were denied food and water for lengthy periods of time. And so the prisoners went on a hunger strike, and committees against torture started all over the country. Just when the authorities thought they had stamped out the RAF, it came to life again. In the RAF's theoretical terms, they provoked the capitalist state to show its true face, and the masses were organizing in response. Elizabeth Van Dyck and other former members of her group from Heidelberg were part of one of these committees against torture. They took leadership, that group took leadership in what came to be known as the second generation of the RAF. And their focus, while still anti-imperialist, theoretically, it was mostly focused on trying to free the prisoners. Van Dyck herself was wanted by the police for two actions that were intended again to release these prisoners. The first was carried out in 1975. It involved the bombing, or it involved first the occupation and taking hostages in the West German embassy in Sweden. Two embassy workers were killed in that action. She was not part of the action, but she was wanted in connection with planning it. She possibly was involved in an action in 1977, which involved the kidnapping the lead businessman in West Germany. And eventually, after an unsuccessful attempt, after 6 weeks of trying to get an exchange for the political prisoners, he was shot. After her own shootout with the police, she fled to Baghdad for a period, and then on returning to West Germany in 1979, she was shot and killed by the police. So I became a Mennonite because we're all pacifists, right? So why would a Mennonite be attracted to a Marxist-Leninist guerrilla organization like the RAF? For 20 years after World War II, West German society was largely silent about its recent Nazi past. The society had to be rebuilt, and the most qualified leaders were the people who had been in the Nazi government or the military. In the mid-1960s, a small trial of Auschwitz employees led to a kind of an awakening among the youth who had grown up in the post-war generation and really did not understand that their parents and grandparents, their politicians, their business leaders, their pastors, had mostly been supportive or even involved directly with the Nazi regime. According to the Mennonite Encyclopedia, Elizabeth von Dijk's West Prussian forebears took regular military service along with other Germans during World War II. So in other words, it's pretty likely that her parents or other relatives would have been Nazi soldiers, and certainly those in the different refugee areas that she circulated in as a youth would have included many recent Nazis. So in that context, it's not too difficult to imagine a young, conscientious Mennonite becoming completely disillusioned with the status quo along with other members of her generation. And it should be noted that von Dijk was not the only Inkenbach Mennonite to join the Red Army faction. Brigitte Schultz, also from that community, in 1976 was arrested in Kenya in connection to the attempted bombing of an Israel airline plane in solidarity with Arab nationalist movements. And on her release in West Germany, she declared that she continued to support the struggle of the Third World against the domination of American imperialism over its economy and culture. Von Dijk, Schultz, and other Red Army faction guerrilla members were engaged in a kind of mission of reconciliation of what at that time was called the First and the Third Worlds. They thought this reconciliation would come about through a revolutionary struggle alongside Third World movements to overthrow the leadership of the First World. Some of those leaders, like the businessman I mentioned and others, would be killed inevitably, but the masses of the First and the Third World, and presumably also the Second Soviet world, would come together. Workers of the world unite, so the slogan went. This mission of reconciliation was based in part on an attempt to understand the aspirations of colonized Third World peoples for political sovereignty. While Henry Vogt may have understood to an extent the detrimental impact of U.S. government policy on the Hopi, he did not take radical action in solidarity with the Hopi to oppose that policy. Von Dijk, Schultz seemed to have had a deeper understanding of the desires of their colonized comrades, on this point at least, and they acted accordingly. But we could also ask just how much they did understand those colonized others with whom they made common cause. Did the Marxist analysis of a uniform global context faced by workers in a capitalist system allow for appreciation of cultural particularities? Would it have allowed for appreciation of the Hopi with their vision of guarding the land not by force of arms and killing? Would this statement have been dismissed as bourgeois, perhaps? Related questions can be asked about the RAF's, and by extension, Von Dijk's understanding of their own first world culture. The RAF thought that their spectacular actions would goad the capitalist state into showing its true face, thereby leading the mass of workers to rise up in revolutionary protest. And although the torture of RAF prisoners did gain them some sympathy, it did not lead to mass action, much less a revolution. So while the legacy of third world decolonization is complex, RAF-style violence did not lead to reconciliation of the first and third worlds. This leads to the third story. At Elizabeth von Dijk's funeral at the Mennonite church in Inkenbach, the famous German Mennonite novelist and sociologist Johannes Harder offered the eulogy. Harder began by affirming von Dijk's cultural interpretation. Our sister, he said, has made it clear to us that we live in a miserable time in an ailing society. But Harder immediately dismissed her means of cultural transformation. Defenders of the current order and those who oppose it with violence are, he said, two variants of the same inhuman drama. Harder then posed a question: where does Christianity remain in all of this? Where is the secular expectation of a realm of justice? He asked, in other words, a question about the mysteries of reconciliation. What kind of reconciliation can Christians promise in this world? Like many other Mennonites in the 1970s, Harder found an answer in a selective reading of early Anabaptist history. The original Anabaptists witnessed to the reality that, here I'm quoting, the spirit is stronger than violence. Good can do more than all tyrants, and justice more than formal law. The Anabaptist martyrs, in particular, show what it means to give one's life for the peaceful cause of reconciliation. And the Anabaptists, of course, point us to Jesus, the executed one who puts an end to all executions. Following Jesus means becoming a peace church, and here I'm quoting, a peace church that has no other mission than to call out for peace and reconciliation in the midst of a world in turmoil. Something of this hope in the peace church in its reconciling mission had motivated Mennonite missionaries and service workers over the previous decades. In 1955, French and North American Mennonites joined together to support a relief effort for Algerians whose societies had been deeply affected by a massive earthquake the previous year. The Mennonite Board of Missions and Charities of the Mennonite Church denomination oversaw the work initially. They sent long-term workers, and soon those workers were joined by staff from Mennonite Central Committee, MCC. So together, the Mission Board, MBMC, and MCC initiated a variety of relief, development, and education projects. In the late 1960s, some Mennonite and other missionaries gave their support to an emerging Algerian church. The church was opposed by the Algerian government, which was increasingly hostile to Western missionaries and eager to take on the missionaries' projects. By 1978, both the Mission Board and MCC had ceased operations in Algeria, although a lone French Mennonite nurse, Annie Aldeman, stayed on until her retirement and probably beyond. So if you're familiar with Algerian history, or just reading ahead here, you'll know that I've left out a significant part of the story. Algeria had been a French colony since the mid-1800s. Algerian soldiers in the French army returned from World War II full of hopes for national sovereignty. And after almost a decade of pursuing that goal by peaceful means, the Algerian National Liberation Front began to launch attacks in 1954. So although the relief work that the Mennonites arrived to carry out was focused on the earthquake, it soon became about this war. The Algerians won independence in 1962, and the war and its aftermath were particularly bloody. And I just want to note that, among other things, this history means that the first 7 years of the Mennonite presence in Algeria would have been carried out under some kind of terms with the French colonial government. The Mission Board was led from 1944 to 1967 by J.D. Graeber. And if you go to the next slide, you'll learn more about him. Thank you. Graeber was a former missionary to India and an MCC worker in China. He articulated his missionary vision in his 1959 Conrad Grebel Lectures, published a year later as a book called The Church Apostolic. In brief, Graeber saw both the capitalist and the communist worlds as dominated by a pursuit of material above spiritual needs. But he didn't find a solution in downplaying the material in favor of the spiritual. Instead, Graeber saw mission as including both acts of material service, offered with no other purpose than to express love, as well as words that would clarify that that service had been carried out in the name of Christ, to use the old MCC slogan, which he used repeatedly. Christian mission in word and deed would both call people to conversion and empower them to lead their own churches. This indigenization principle was at the heart of what mission scholar Bruce Yoder has called the partnership model of mission that came to characterize mid-century Mennonite mission. As Graeber and others designed that partnership model, it was intentionally supposed to avoid what Graeber called spiritual imperialism. Graeber was keenly aware of the reality of decolonization and saw mission as needing to respond. In that model, partnerships were prioritized both with other mission agencies and with indigenous-led churches. The priority there was partnership over the establishment of Mennonite churches. Graeber's successor, Wilbert Schenck, would develop the model under the inspiration of a similar reading of Anabaptist history as inspired Johannes Harder. In Schenck's view, that history led to a form of mission in which dialogue and respect for the partner, for cultural others, in fact, was to characterize Peace Church mission. In this context, Schenck and his colleagues began to talk about peace building as itself a form of mission work. The Algerian Mennonite mission bears the hallmarks of Graeber's approach. Loving acts of service were offered in the name of Christ. There was no attempt to establish a Mennonite church, but support was given to an Algerian-led church, along with ecumenical partners. This pattern was also implemented in West Africa, Argentina, Japan, the United Kingdom, and elsewhere. The phrase mission without conquest, used to describe the Argentine case, could be applied in many of these settings. This approach to mission could be described as an alternative mission of reconciliation to those pursued by Henry Vogt and Elizabeth von Dijk. The Graeber-led missionaries, like Vogt, prized deep cultural understanding. But we don't see in their work in Algeria a sense that this understanding was for merely instrumental reasons, merely to convert people, merely to understand them for some kind of scientific project. Cultural understanding was seen as vital to effective service based on an accurate perception of the needs and desires of those being served. And as an aside, an important aside, we can imagine here what Vogt's reconciling mission and his cultural understanding might have looked like if his wife Martha's relations with Hopi women had been given priority over intrusions on sacred Hopi rituals. Compared to von Dijk and to the Red Army faction, the Mennonite missionaries' commitment to the Algerians' political aspirations appears rather weak. After all, the Mennonites arrived in Algeria under the auspices of the colonial government, and as far as I'm aware, they did nothing to promote the cause of Algerian independence. Support for an Algerian church, framed by Graeber's vision of a third way between capitalism and communism, seems rather mild when placed alongside von Dijk's explosive anti-imperial partnerships with Third World revolutionaries. On the other hand, mission scholar Anika Fast describes how Mennonite mission has sought to, and I quote, constitute a peoplehood that forms a political alternative to the violence and exclusivity of nation states and political boundaries. In colonial and post-colonial contexts, and she's writing about Congo, but this might apply to Algeria and elsewhere, she argues that the church can become a site of economic and political empowerment and liberation beyond what is promised by either imperialist powers or their armed anti-colonial adversaries. This is what Fast sees in the Mennonite churches of Congo, and it's important to note here that she does not see this as the outworking of peace church-minded missionaries. She sees this largely as a fruit of the Congolese advocating for their own desires and needs, and the missionaries eventually realizing, okay, this is how the church must be. And I'll say that many of us in this room can certainly attest to similar experiences of having our own understanding, our own intercultural understanding transformed as we relate to Mennonites in colonial and post-colonial contexts. Here we see a form of reconciliation that does not hinge on the relatively powerful's accurate understanding, solidarity with the relatively powerless. Rather, reconciliation depends on an intercultural encounter in which the relatively powerless assert the force of their own understanding to form the encounter and the resulting community. The relatively powerful make or find themselves vulnerable to change, to having their understanding shifting, and to even having their understanding on the nature of reconciliation shift. So is this the answer to the mystery of reconciliation? Well, if so, it's a solution that does sound a lot like Ephesians, in which intercultural community is a fruit and sign of Christ's reconciliation of all things with God through the cross. Christ on the cross enters into solidarity with the suffering of the world. A Jew in colonized Palestine, he submits to imperial violence in order to overcome it, not with more violence, but with steadfast commitment to an alternative political order, the reign of God. As my colleague Drew Strait has written, and here I'm quoting, whereas imperial Rome pacified ethnic enmity through militarized coercion and imposed cultural homogeneity, Paul understands the Christ event is God's apocalyptic peacemaking disruption of ethno-racial enmity, an invitation to embrace human difference rather than fear it. He goes on to describe, and here if you'd advance the slide, please, Drew describes how for Paul this reorientation of cultural allegiances does not eliminate cultural difference. In Christ, he writes, the peace and justice of God liberate the weak and reorient the power of the strong to form peaceable and just multicultural communities of fellowship. He goes on to say, in this messianic economy of human difference, Christ believers are habituated into a shared mission of just peace or peacemaking that interrupts domination systems, military enslavement, xenophobia, through a shared ministry of reconciliation that is restorative, reparative, transformative, and justice-making among formerly alienated peoples. So there we are, back to Ephesians. Back to Christ putting enmity to death, forming one body out of groups previously bitterly opposed. We're back to a model of a reconciling peace church mission in which understanding occurs through an intercultural process of mutual transformation, in which violence is refused, but the political sovereignty of the oppressed is affirmed in and through the reconciling Christian community. Is this the solution to the mysteries of reconciliation? Is it enough to say again that the mystery has, in fact, now been revealed by the Spirit? The mystery of reconciliation in Christ, in and through the church. Is it enough to say again that we get a decisive clue from Anabaptist history, from the present global church, into what reconciliation might look like, does look like, in the present? I really want to say yes. I'm compelled to say yes by theological conviction, by Anabaptist allegiance, and my own experience in the church. And yet, I struggle with the inconsistent witness of the church to reconciliation. Inconsistent is putting it mildly. I struggle, for example, with the bitter irony that Johannes Harder, who preached Peace Church mission at Elizabeth von Dijk's funeral, had been a member of the Waffen-SS, a Nazi paramilitary force that took a leading role in the extermination of Jews. This was only really understood in the recent years. Harder was the type of person von Dijk was rebelling against, someone who had faced few consequences for participation in extreme horror, and was now a celebrated leader in church and society. What does Peace Church mean in the mouth of Johannes Harder? Is it an evasion of more costly repentance, of more costly solidarity with the victims of violence, of more costly support for their political aspirations? What does Peace Church mean for us? If we refuse Elizabeth von Dijk's mission of reconciliation through violence, and I hope we do, the challenge of her radical anti-imperialist understanding of sovereignty remains. We can hear similar challenges from the Hopi statement I read, from the Algerians, and from so many others. What kind of peace church? What kind of peace church mission? What kind of peace church politics could be shaped by understanding such challenges? The answer, to me at least, is still a mystery. Thank you.